Do you ever wonder why some photos that you take are razor sharp, while others completely miss focus even though you thought you nailed it? Most of the time, it comes down to autofocus modes. In today's video, we're talking about autofocus and why it's so important to fully understand each mode so you can select the right one when you're setting up your scene and you nail focus in every shot that you take. Throw that camera into manual mode and let's get started. There are two main autofocus modes for you to pay attention to and that I'm going to talk about today for you to utilize when you're setting up every shot that you take. The first one is continuous autofocus, or on Canon cameras, oftentimes called servo. The other one is one-shot autofocus. Some cameras also have AI autofocus, but that can be pretty finicky, and quite frankly, I don't even know anybody who uses it. Some of the new cameras that are coming out are even equipped with eye tracking autofocus, which I'm not going to get into today because I haven't used it yet. The first mode we're going to focus on today is continuous autofocus, or as I mentioned on Canon, servo. Continuous autofocus is extremely helpful when you're photographing moving subjects. It's what allows your camera to lock onto one specific subject within your scene and track them throughout it. So that's front to back, left to right, anywhere it goes, your camera can lock its focus onto them. Think of it like this. If your subject is moving, like a person or an animal, it's best to use continuous autofocus because your camera will be able to do the dirty work for you and lock that focus onto them. There are a few settings within your camera that affect how continuous autofocus works, so we're going to get into those because the better that you tailor them to your shooting style and to what you're actually shooting, the more successful you'll find that your continuous autofocus setting will be every single time you press that shutter button. The first is subject tracking, and with subject tracking, you are basically telling your camera what specific type of subject you want it to prioritize focusing on. Now, not all cameras have the exact same subject tracking settings, but majority of modern cameras these days have at least these 3 or 4 that I'm going to touch on. The first is people tracking, and you can get as nitty-gritty as to select which eye you'd like your camera to focus on when it sees a person. So it'll look for the left eye if you select left, right eye if you select right, or in my case, I just have that set to auto, so it'll select either eye on a person's face. There are benefits, however, to selecting a specific eye because if you're a portrait photographer, then you can maintain autofocus consistency by always having your camera focus on a person's right eye. The next is animals. That's anything from dogs and cats to horses and elephants. So if you're primarily shooting animals and wildlife photography, this is the subsetting for you to use within your subject tracking. The next subject is cars, and this one's pretty self-explanatory. Great for automobile photographers. Most cameras have a fourth setting, which is automatic, or in the menu's case, it's auto. Now, this will ultimately let your camera decide which subject it thinks you want to focus on. As a photographer who captures quite a bit of different subjects, I still keep mine in people subject tracking mode because oftentimes there are people within my scenes and our eyes are naturally drawn to people when we're looking at photographs. So when in doubt, it's great to focus on a person. It's also worth noting that some high-end newer cameras are equipped with even more subject tracking, and that will continue to expand as new cameras come out. For example, there are some cameras that have bird subject tracking, so that's perfect for a wildlife photographer who is always capturing birds. They can pinpoint their focus on that flying bird through the air rather than having their camera try and guess what they should actually be focusing on. Similar to subject tracking, the next setting that will ultimately affect how your autofocus functions is autofocus sensitivity. This will tell your camera how much of a priority to put on maintaining focus on the subject that you're tracking within your image. For example, you may be a sports photographer who's trying to lock focus on a single soccer player dribbling a ball down the field. Now, there are 22 players on the field and 3 officials typically, so there's a lot of people for your camera to ultimately ignore and maintain focus on that one subject. One way to help your camera do this is by decreasing the autofocus sensitivity. This will ultimately tell your camera to prioritize maintaining focus on that one soccer player rather than being confused and jumping focus to all other people on the field. This will ensure that you never miss the game-winning shot and you're actually focusing on the people and subjects that you want to focus on within your image. Now, I know what you're thinking. Continuous autofocus sounds pretty great because it does a lot of the work for you. You may ask yourself, why would I use anything other than continuous autofocus? Well, Let me explain. Have you ever gone to edit a photo and your focus is just slightly off? It's close, but it's not razor sharp. And you're frustrated because your subject wasn't even moving. So what went wrong? This is where one-shot autofocus comes in handy. One-shot autofocus allows you to pick one single focal point within your scene and lock your focus onto it for the entire time that you have the autofocus button pressed. It allows you as the photographer to get nitpicky on the exact point at which you want your camera to focus. It's not letting your camera make an educated guess on what it thinks you want to focus on like it does in continuous autofocus. The caveat to this one is that one-shot autofocus locks your focus from front to back. If you and your subject are not moving, it's a great way to ensure proper focus within your image. But if you or your subject takes one step forward or backwards and you don't reset your focus, there's a very good chance that your subject is going to be out of focus. Think about how depth of field works, which I talked about in my last video, linked up here. One-shot autofocus locks your focal point and will not move front to back. So if you have a really narrow depth of field, if your subject takes a step backwards, they're likely going to be outside of that focal plane and you're going to have a blurry subject. In this case, one-shot autofocus is great for shooting objects that you know aren't going to be moving. I personally find it helpful to switch between both continuous autofocus and one-shot autofocus when I'm out shooting events. For this reason, I have a singular button set up on the front of my camera to swap between the two modes, so I'm continuously doing that as I'm shooting. Typically, I'll use one-shot autofocus when I'm getting my establishing shots at an event, where I'm not focusing on one individual person, rather the scene as a whole. I'll also use it when I'm shooting stationary objects. Then, when it comes time to shoot objects that are moving or people, I'll hit the button on the front of my camera and swap into continuous autofocus mode. Now that you have a better understanding of how both continuous and one-shot autofocus work, I want to talk about how you initiate your autofocus. Out of the box, your camera will initiate autofocus when you half press the shutter button, and that's what most people are used to. While that may seem intuitive because that's how it's typically done, there is another way that will actually help you speed up your shooting process. That is where back button autofocus comes into play. Back button autofocus is when you assign a button on the back of your camera to initiate your autofocus rather than having it be half pressing the shutter button. Once you get the hang of this new layout and have the muscle memory of pressing the back button and then the shutter button for your picture, back button autofocus allows you to quickly swap between what you're focusing while you're continuing to shoot. With the traditional method, you have to stop shooting so you can then repress the half shutter and then continue shooting. Back button autofocus is a helpful technique for anyone who's shooting wildlife, weddings, sports, really anybody who wants just a little bit more flexibility and control over their autofocus. Like I said before, it feels weird at first, but once you get the muscle memory down, you'll quickly realize how much it increases your speed and accuracy when you're out shooting with autofocus. I'll use Canon as an example because that's what I shoot on. First, you'll want to change shutter button half press to metering start. This is going to disable the autofocus initiation when you half press the shutter button. Then scroll down to AF on and change that to metering and AF start. Once this is set up, you will initiate autofocus by using the AF on button on the back of your camera, and then you'll take your picture by using the shutter button as you typically would. While you're in the settings menu, you can customize a button on the front of your camera to swap between one-shot autofocus and continuous autofocus, as I said before. Do this by selecting the DOF preview button and changing that to one-shot to continuous. In my case, it says one shot to servo because I'm on Canon, but yours may say one shot to AFC or one shot to continuous. If you don't have the DOF preview button, just pick another button on your camera that is customizable and it's in a location that feels easily accessible to you so you can easily swap between the two autofocus modes when you're out shooting. The combination of these two customizations will greatly improve the speed at which you can activate the proper autofocus mode for your shooting scenario. Now that you have a basic understanding of how autofocus works, I highly encourage you to test out both modes to see which works best for you in your specific shooting style. It also comes down to what you're shooting, so my needs may be different than yours. If you follow the tips in this video, I'm confident that you will set yourself up for success to go out and nail focus on every single shot that you take. If you found this video helpful, feel free to stick around for a while by subscribing, and check out this video that I did where I dive into the 3 settings that make up the exposure triangle and how they all work together. Until next time, go out and use your camera.